Friendship, our topic in this seminar, is so closely linked to the definition of philosophy that one can say that without it, philosophy would not in fact be possible. The intimacy of friendship and philosophy is so deep that philosophy includes the philos, the friend, in its very name, and as often is the case with all excessive proximities, one risks not being able to get to the bottom of it. In the classical world, this promiscuity and almost consubstantiality of the friend and philosopher was taken for granted, and it was certainly not without a somewhat archaizing intent that a contemporary philosopher, when posing the extreme question, what is philosophy, was able to write that it was a question to be dealt with entre amiss. Today, the relation between friendship and philosophy has actually fallen into discredit, and it is with some sort of embarrassment and uneasy conscience that professional philosophers try to come to terms with such an uncomfortable and, so to speak, clandestine partner of their thought. Many years ago, my friend Jean-Luc Nancy and I decided to exchange letters on the subject of friendship. We were convinced that this was the best way of approaching and almost staging a problem which seemed otherwise to elude analytical treatment. I wrote the first letter and waited, not without trepidation, for a reply. This is not the place to try to understand the reasons or perhaps misunderstandings that caused the arrival of Jean-Luc's letter to signify the end of the project, but it is certain that our friendship, which, according to our plans, should have given us privileged access to the problem, was an obstacle for us, and was consequently, in a way, at least temporarily obscured. Out of an analogous and probably conscious uneasiness, Jacques Derrida chose the leitmotif of his book on friendship, a syllabine motto, traditionally attributed to Aristotle, that negates friendship in the very gesture which seems to invoke it. O philoi odis philos. O friends, there are no friends. One of the concerns of the book is, in fact, a critique of what the author defines as the phallocentric conception of friendship that dominates our philosophical and political tradition. While Derrida was still working on the seminar which gave birth to the book, we had discussed together a curious philological problem that concerned precisely the motto or witticism in question. One finds it cited by, amongst others, Montaigne and Nietzsche, who would have derived it from Diogenes Laertius. But if we open a modern edition of the Lives of Philosophers, we do not find, in the chapter dedicated to the biography of Aristotle, the phrase in question, but rather almost identical in appearance, the meaning of which is nonetheless different and far less enigmatic. O philoi odis philos, he who has many friends has no friend. A library visit was enough to clarify the mystery. In 1616, a Genevan philologist, Isaac Casaubon, decided to publish a new edition of the Lives. Arriving at the passage in question, which still read in the edition procured by his father-in-law, Henry Etienne, O philoi, O friends, he corrected the enigmatic version of the manuscripts without hesitation. It became perfectly intelligible and for this reason was accepted by modern editors. Since I had immediately informed Derrida of the results of my research, I was astonished when his book was published under the title Politique d'amitié, not to find any trace of the problem. If the motto, apocryphal according to modern philologists, appeared there in its original form, it was certainly not out of forgetfulness. It was essential to the book's strategy that friendship be at the same time both affirmed and distrustfully revoked. In this, Derrida's gesture repeated that of Nietzsche. While a student of philology, Nietzsche had begun a work on the sources of Diogenes Laertius and the textual history of lives, and therefore also Casaubon's amendment, must have been perfectly familiar to him. But both the necessity of friendship and, at the same time, a certain distrust towards friends were essential to Nietzsche's strategy. This accounts for his recourse to the traditional reading, which was already, by Nietzsche's time, no longer current. It is possible that the peculiar semantic status of the term friend has contributed to the uneasiness of modern philosophers. It is well known that no one has ever been able to explain satisfactorily the meaning of the syntagm, I love you, so much so that one might think that it has a performative character, that its meaning coincides, that is, with the act of its utterance. Analogous considerations could be made for the expression, I am your friend. Even if here a recourse to the performative category does not seem possible, I believe that friend, belongs instead to that class of terms which linguists define as non-predicative terms, that is, on the basis of which it is not possible to construct a class of objects in which one might group the things to which one applies the predicate in question, white, hard, and hot, are certainly predicative terms. But is it possible to say that friend defines, in this sense, a coherent class? Strange as it might seem, friend shares this characteristic with another species of non-predicative terms, insults. Linguists have demonstrated that an insult does not offend the person who receives it because it places him in a particular category, for example, that of excrement or male or female sex organs, depending on the language, which would simply be impossible or, in any case, false. The insult is effective precisely because it does not function as a constantive utterance, but rather as a proper name, because it uses language to name in a way that cannot be accepted by the person named, and from which he nevertheless cannot defend himself. What offends in the insult is, to be precise, a pure experience of language and not a reference to the world. If this is true, friend would share this condition not only with insults, but also with philosophical terms. Terms which, as is well known, do not have an objective denotation, and which, like those terms medieval logicians labeled as transcendent, simply signify existence. For this reason, before getting to the heart of our seminar, I would like you to observe carefully the reproduction of the painting Serodine which you see before you. The painting, kept in Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Antica in Rome, depicts the encounter of the apostles Peter and Paul on the road to martyrdom. The two saints, motionless, occupy the center of the canvas, surrounded by the disorderly gesticulation of soldiers and executioners who are leading them to their death. Critics have often drawn attention to the contrast between the heroic rigor of the two apostles and the commotion of the crowd, lit up here and there by the flecks of light sketched almost randomly on the arms, the faces, the trumpets. For my part, I think that what makes this painting truly incomparable is that Serodine has portrayed the two apostles so close together, with their foreheads almost glued onto one another, that they are absolutely unable to see each other. On the road to martyrdom, they look at, without recognizing each other. This impression of an excessive proximity, as it were, is accentuated by the silent gesture of shaking hands at the bottom of the picture, scarcely visible. It has seemed to me that this painting contains a perfect allegory of friendship. What is friendship, in effect, if not proximity, such that it is impossible to make for oneself either representation or a concept of it? To recognize someone as a friend means not to be able to recognize him as something. One cannot say friend as one says white, Italian, hot. Friendship is not a property or quality of our subject. But it is time to begin a reading of the Aristotelian passage upon which I intend to comment. The philosopher dedicates to friendship a veritable treatise, which occupies the 8th and 9th books of the Nicomachean Ethics. Since we are dealing with one of the most celebrated and discussed texts in the entire history of philosophy, I will take for granted a knowledge of its most well-established thesis, that one cannot live without friends, that it is necessary to distinguish between friendship founded on utility and on pleasure of virtuous friendship, in which the friend is loved as such, that friendship at a distance tends to result in oblivion, etc. All this is very well known. There is, however, a passage of the treatise which appears to me not to have received sufficient attention, although it contains, so to speak, the ontological basis of the theory. And if the one who sees perceives that he sees, the one who hears perceives that he hears, the one who walks perceives that he walks, and similarly, in the other cases there is something that perceives that we are in activity, so that if we perceive, it perceives that we perceive, and if we think, it perceives that we think, and if perceiving that we perceive or think is perceiving we exist, for, as we said, existing is perceiving or thinking, and if perceiving that one is alive is pleasant in itself, for being alive is something naturally good, and perceiving what is good as being there in oneself is pleasant, and if being alive is desirable, and especially so for the good, because for them existing is good and pleasant, for concurrent perception of what is in itself good, in themselves, gives them pleasure. And if, as the good person is to himself, so he is to his friend, since the friend is another self. Then just as for his own existence is desirable, so his friend's is too, or to a similar degree. But as we saw, the good man's existence is desirable because his perceiving himself, that self being good, and such perceiving is pleasant in itself. In that case, he needs to be concurrently perceiving his friend, that he exists too, and this will come about in their living together, conversing and sharing their talk and their thoughts. For this is what would seem to be meant by living together, where human beings are concerned, not feeding in the same location as with grazing animals. For our friendship is community, and as we are in relation to ourselves, so are we in relation to the friend. And since the perception of our own existence is desirable, so too is that existence of a friend. We are dealing with an extraordinarily dense passage, since Aristotle enunciates here some theses of first philosophy that are not encountered in this form in any of his other writings. 1. There is a pure perception of being, an aesthesis of existence. Aristotle repeats this a number of times, mobilizing the technical vocabulary of ontology. 2. The perception of existing is, in itself, pleasant. 3. There is an equivalence between being and living, between awareness of one's existing and awareness of one's living. There is decidedly an anticipation of the Nietzschean thesis according to which being, we have no other experience of it than to live. 4. Inheritance perception of existing is another perception, specifically human, which takes the form of a concurrent perception of the friend's existence. Friendship is the instance of this concurrent perception of the friend's existence in the awareness of one's own existence. But this means that friendship has an ontological and, at the same time, political dimension. The perception of existing is, in fact, always already divided up and shared or condivided. Friendship names this sharing or condivision. There is no trace of any intersubjectivity, that chimera of moderns, nor any relation between subjects. Rather, the existing self is divided. It is non-identical to itself. The I and the friend are two faces, or the two poles of this condivision. 5. The friend is, for this reason, another self, a heteros autos. In its Latin translation, alter ego. The expression has a long history, which this is not the place to construct. But it is important to note that the Greek formulation is expressive of more than a modern ear perceives in it. In the first place, Greek, like Latin, has two terms to express otherness. Allos is a generic otherness, while heteros is otherness as an opposition between two as heterogeneity. Furthermore, the Latin ego does not exactly translate to autos, which signifies oneself. The friend is not another I, but an otherness immanent in selfness, a becoming other of the self. At the point which I perceive my existence as pleasant, my perception is traversed by concurrent perception that dislocates it and deports it towards the friend, towards the other self. Friendship is the desubjectivization at the very heart of the most intimate perception of self. At this point, the ontological dimension in Aristotle can be taken for granted. Friendship belongs to the proto-philosophia, because that which is in question in it concerns the very experience, the very perception of existing. One understands then why friend cannot be a real predicate, one that is added to a concept to inscribe that it is a certain class. In modern terms, one might say that friend is existential and not a categorical. But this existential, which, as such, is unable to be conceptualized, is nonetheless intersected by an intensity that charges it with something like a political potency. This intensity is the sin, the con which divides, disseminates, and renders condivisible, in fact, already always condivided, the very perception, the very pleasantness of existing. That this condivision might have, for Aristotle, a political significance is implicit in the passage of text we have just analyzed and to which it is opportune to return. In that case, he needs to be concurrently perceiving his friend, that he exists, and this will come about in their living together, conversing and sharing their talk and their thoughts. For this is what would seem to be meant by living together, where human beings are concerned, not feeding in the same location as with grazing animals. The expression translated as feeding in the same location is en auto nemisthai, but the verb nemo, which, as you know, is rich with political implications, in the middle voice also means to partake, and in the Aristotelian expression could mean simply to partake of the same. It is essential in any case that human community should here be defined, in contrast to that of animals, through a cohabitation which is not defined by participating in a common substance but purely existential condivision, so to speak, one without subject. Friendship as concurrent perception of the pure fact of existence. How this original political synesthesia could become, in the course of time, the consensus to which democracies entrust their fates in this latest extreme and exhaustive phase of their evolution is, as they say, another story, and one upon I shall leave you to reflect.